Hello and most welcome to 1729 of the Heidegger series, and we will continue with the Book of Revelation by Timothy Beal, and we will continue where we left off in 1725. Page 112 in the written edition. The PDF is 131. And we ended just to read the third paragraph, the great irony. It's further down. And what we discussed in 1725 was the great interactedness of reality. And how the Omicrons gather together to make for the necessary oppositions that can create unity. They were together, but all also at the very same time different. This is something in the modern day, already in the 19th century, that was impossible, started to become impossible to understand because of development in thinking. One of the psalms, the hymns, 3 in 1, was most often used to discourage people for searching faith, religion, God. That in itself, with no extra additive, was quite enough to discourage people being so utterly impossible. I think that in itself is extremely interesting. We've got a change in thinking. We have quite enormous complicated consequences of of unfathomable effects. And I would say one of those effects is definitely that we isolate today. We no longer allow difference. It's a sort of focused attention idea. Close off all other options and focus on only one thing. I would call that a narrowing of understanding and a narrowing of consciousness itself. And I continue where I stopped last time. Chapter is named You Are Here. That is referring to the point in the illustration where you are. The great irony of the book of Revelation, as much as we have seen, is that what it claims to reveal remains very much hidden behind the veil, encrypted and encoded within and between its lines. It is an apocalypse that covers more than it uncovers. A revelation that veils more than it unveils. It uncovers a covering, reveals a veiling. One of Joachim's favorite biblical images comes from the story of Moses' veiled face. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the tablets of the law, his face was so radiant with divine presence that it terrified the Israelites. Therefore, whenever he was not addressing them, he would cover his face with a veil. This same veil is referred to metaphorically in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, where he writes, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed, and all of us with unveiled faces, now behold God's glory as though reflected in a mirror. In Joachim's work, the veiled text of Scripture are brought to light via the kaleidoscopic play of mirrors, revealing to the mind's eye shapes and patterns heretofore hidden. And revelation is the key to everything. In digital media technology, a codec is a device or program that both encodes and decodes information. The term itself is a portmanteau of the words code and decode. Early codecs were hardware devices such as CD and DVD recorders and players that encoded analog data into digital form for storage. And then decoded that data back into analog form for users to access. Later, the term was adopted for computer programs, especially video and audio codecs like QuickTime and MPG. Which encode and compress sounds and images for digital storage and decode them for viewing and listening. In Joachim's hands, revelation was something like a medieval codec, a device for both encoding and decoding information about the past, present, and future of sacred history. Those with eyes to see could discover that information encoded information about the past, present, and future of sacred history. Those with eyes to see could discover that information encoded and stored within, and then watch as it decoded itself in the clear understanding of his mind's eye into the full meaning of the entirety of sacred history. Thus Joachim brought revelation to life in yet another new form, as a kind of codec in which is encoded the full truth of the entirety of the scriptures. Which themselves embody and comprehend the entirety of God's plan for creation from beginning to end. Its scenes and images are decoded to reveal actual historical events and persons along that larger biblical arc. As rigorously analytical as it is creatively imaginative, This apocalyptic methodology is intensely visual, spinning itself out in lavish designs wherein shapes and patterns mirror letters and words and vice versa. Indeed, unlike Hildegard's images, which are for the most part representational, depicting particular apocalyptic scenes that involve recognizable, if also often disturbingly unusual characters. Joachim's visual figures are built from abstractions. Shapes become letters and words, even as letters and words become shapes, touching and overlapping to create interconnected webs of space and time. Revealing the mind of God to the mind's eye of the seer. While Joachim's particular biblical interpretations have been highly influential, since even before his death, his creatively intellectual apocalyptic methodology of visual figuring in word and image has proven even more influential. We will see its lineage running through the subsequent life of Revelation, flourishing especially in the visual diagrams of the late 19th and early 20th century interpreters like Clarence Larkin, whose visual designs of sacred history as a series of dispensations of divine grace have been cornerstones of Christian fundamentalism. The Joachimite ancestry of such visual dispensationalism is unmistakable. Not surprisingly for Joachim, as for the hosts who have followed him in his approach, the maps and the diagrams always seem to reveal the present moment as the most significant. You are here, they show us, on the very cusp of God's favored time, at the very beginning of escalation toward the consummation of all things, which is just around the corner. What a radical departure from Augustine's city of God, which pushed Revelation's seals, trumpets, and beasts well into the distant future. From now on, the end is near. And that was also the end of chapter 5. We can maybe continue a little bit with chapter 6, since I have it printed out, some of it. September's Testament, Luther's Bible versus Cranach's revelation. Recall that the book of Revelation was far from a shoeing in for inclusion in the canon of the New Testament during the early centuries of Christianity. Its case was strengthened by those who confused its John with John the beloved disciple, to whom was attributed the Gospel of John, and the three letters of John. Still, many rejected it, calling it an incoherent, poorly conceived, and badly written fraud. Well into the 4th century, as Eusebius makes clear, its scriptural status was a matter of dispute. Yes, Bishop Athanasius does include it as the final book of his New Testament canon in 367 Common Era. But the fact that he needed to assert this particular canonical list in the first place suggests that what was in and what was out was still a matter of disagreement. Recall too that the establishment of the New Testament canon by the end of the 4th century had as much to do with media technology as it did with ecclesiastical authority. The establishment of Roman Christianity as the religion of the empire, which led to an increasing drive to consolidate and control ecclesiastical power, coincided with the development of the media technology of a codex big enough to hold an entire canon of Old and New Testament texts in a single volume. This new medium of the big codex and the new status of Christendom as the imperial religion worked hand in hand to close the canon. By 420 Common Era, Jerome had produced an entire Bible in the Latin of his time, based primarily on translations of Greek and Hebrew biblical texts. This Bible, which included the same 27 books of the New Testament as Athanasius lists, eventually become the standard Vulgate Bible for all Western Christianity. Yet we would be mistaken to believe that this closing of the canon was entirely secure or permanent. Indeed, the Vulgate itself was never fixed nor changeless. Although Jerome had excluded books such as Baruch and Tobit as apocryphal because they did not appear in his Hebrew manuscripts. All the Vulgate Bibles that have survived include them. And although he, like Athanasius, had excluded Paul's letter to the Laodiceans, some of the oldest known manuscripts of the Vulgate include it. Another early manuscript replaces the four separate Gospels with a single harmonization. We might have expected the invention in the 15th century of the printing press and the rise of the print book culture, with the Bible as its flagship, to have finally fixed and closed the biblical canon once and for all. Mechanical printing and fixed type, after all, made it possible to produce thousands of copies of one book, each identical to the next. But for such biblical uniformity and permanence to be achieved, there would need to have been a single original book to mass produce in the first place. When it came to Christian scriptures, there was no such thing. What happened with the print revolution then was not a fixing and binding of the Bible, but a greater unfixing and unbinding of it. Within 2 decades of the publication of Gutenberg's first Latin Vulgate Bible in 1456, there were 9 German Bibles in print. By the mid-16th century, as Protestantism gained momentum, many different Bibles would appear in many other modern languages as well. And these would often include different canons of different texts translated from different original manuscripts in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. So we put a remembrance there on that page. We have the number. C ends with Greek, Latin, Greek, Hebrew. And what number would that be in? The recording was paused here. I think we need to redo the quote we just made. So we are now taking the summary here. We go back to page 112. And the apocalypto is a covering that covers more than it uncovers. A revelation, unveiling, or unveiling, that veils more than it unveils. It uncovers a covering, reveals a veiling. And on page 113, we look to a famous happening when Moses descended from Mount Sinai. His face is so radiant with divine presence, so he has to cover it with a veil. This very same veil is used metaphorically in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. When one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed, and all of us with unveiled faces now behold God's glory as though reflected in a mirror. We have mentioned this many times before. Excuse me. How truth, as we know it in physics today, is taking both covering and uncovering. I think that became abundantly clear with Terry Marks Tarlow's fantastic metaphor with a coastline, where it's impossible to say what is land or what is sea, but the most important is the very act of unveiling. That would be almost, I think, in the old perspective, to have some sort of magic that the coastline changes. It's not fixed, or the fixture and movement is exactly in the border zone between the two things that we normally perceive as fixed: waterside, beachside, and terra firma, that is ground. Also Heidegger's Thea and Aletheia, constant covering and uncovering. The necessary act of bringing out truth and reality is this covering, uncovering. And in Joachim's work, there is the use of a kaleidoscopic play of mirrors further down, revealing to the mind's eye shapes and patterns heretofore hidden. And revelation is the key to everything. I think this goes to the opening of knowledge from that blocking out we have today. That truth is something separate, separable, for handen, to use a Heideggerian term, and that in your own life you can say, I will have that knowledge, and that is separated from everything else. So I just consume that bit, so to speak, to use the computer phrase, and I understand. In that case, you sort of just need to read that Bible verse or have that original. That we know is not true. It comes from all relations. How you brush your teeth, how you walk, especially as we have mentioned in the series. Your bodily attitude is of enormous importance for every little understanding. They can only be separate if they are all together. They are tangled. And I'd say it's this tangled nature of reality that Joachim is pointing to. Go further down, and I just mentioned here there is a comparison made by the author, Beal, to codec. I'm not sure it's the best one, since it could give the idea that everything is sort of in QuickTime, MPEG, and JPEG, and you all know those. Everything is contained within it, more or less. I'd say in Jacob's take, as much more. There is not a germ in what's covered. It's the necessary part, but it's not the original, if you understand. So it gives more, much, much more. And the third phrase here is add unfoldment instead of a codec, a device, an unfoldment that both encode and decode the information about the past, present, and future of sacred history. This is how we come to the synchronic time. But we need a metaphor that takes in oppositions and do not give the idea of a germ or an ideal form. Once more, we have the black box problem, as you're well aware of a sort of inner origin that give fruition to all the rest. If you continue, you can go. I think what Joachim did here, we can stop there. The comparison of Hildegard and Joachim. Hildegard's images are mostly representational. And the word to look out for here is representational. And I think the better one here is Joachim's visual figures. And as we read here on the 8th line from Joachim's visual figures are built from abstractions. Shapes become letters and words, even as letters and words become shapes, touching and overlapping to create interconnected webs of space and time, revealing the mind of God to the mind's eye of the seer. So you see, shapes can become letters, that can be animals. You cleaning your teeth in a skilled way will affect how you think. You can see cleaning of the teeth, brushing your teeth, as the animal that makes your thinking letters. If that rather search analogy works. We tend to separate, fragment everything, and say that there are truth bits out there we can just digest. No, Joachim is pointing to something much, much greater. A definite explosion of understanding. When oppositions can be in all aspects of one's life are being advanced, fortified. I can give one example. The theologians already in the beginning of the last century helped to provoke fragmentation by just having one subject, isolating for hand and doing, and then they obscured the Joachimian vision most definitely. Oh, we're going on long here. I need to stretch. Kalle, some comments?
Well, could you please develop a bit this what you said here? Why is the analogy not good? I think the problem is, if I understand correctly, is that the mechanical thing is the ideal, implicit ideal.
Yes.
If everything is identical, like a CD, everything is identical. Once you can produce the same songs identically, millions of copies, And that would be the ideal. That is the wow. That is very. That is the. I think that was your point, also, Hans.
Could you repeat the last one?
Your point was that the implicit ideal is the CD or DVD or the MPG. If you can reproduce something in identical copies, that is the ideal.
Yes, yes. I understand Timothy Beal. There is no other metaphor for him to look at. So he's done his very best. Unless, as we have done, spend so much time in looking into Julian Barber, David Bohm, and specific ideas that are not simply not accessible. So that's in itself very interesting. And I think, as he writes, Timothy Beal has the larger understanding, and when he uses tools, he can use the only ones that are available. But they could be misleading still.
But we have better metaphors. You use the metaphor of the Norwegian coast in the fractal theory. But I have also another, I think is very relevant.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
About the codex. So he speaks about, let me see, the codex. Let me see. You could place everything without media technology. And my metaphor would be to use the metaphor of the leaf of a tree. As we know, they are never identical.
No.
I think this works well. So I would compare perhaps the Bible to leaves. They're similar, one leaf to another, but they're never identical. So therefore, we shouldn't expect that biblical canon would be identical from one book, from one codex to another. They're fractal, like the Bible is fractal.
Yes.
There are differences in the canon.
Very good, Kalle. What builds up something that can be stable, that could be understood, needs to be fractal in that way. We cannot understand things that are not fractal, because there are simply no such things.
And I could use to be a little bit, let me see, fish, eel, excuse me, actually spelled eel. so eel is a picture that the Bible is a bit like the canon is like a eel. You can never, so to say, grasp it. It's always eludes you.
Yeah.
Yes. But that's something negative, implicitly negative of Beal, I think. But ideally, it shouldn't be identical. Otherwise, there would be something wrong.
Yes.
When you have a dictator in a state, then you can have identity. You can perhaps copy. That would be worrisome if everything would be identical, because that would imply that you have a dictator there dictating. You have to have identical things everywhere. So I think the leaf metaphor or
the leaf, and even more visual with the thorn metaphor. But yeah, very good. Yeah, fantastic.
what beautiful they are. So you could even imagine like the papyrus, the early papyrus. The papyrus are actually written papyrus. They're not identical either to each other. The papyrus leaves. Let me see how. So why? So why should we suppose that the Bible itself should be, or the canon should be identical to itself when there are differences?
Yes.
To our naked eye, all look similar.
Yeah.
To our untrained eyes, they look similar, but they're not.
This is the reason why we are stuck in the diachronic, and even believers cannot feel God. It's impossible, because if you don't start out with fractality, you don't get identity or permanence. That's most interesting. It's without fractality, you can't even believe in a permanent life. It shows most of this desperation in modern people. And Joachim was incredibly talented in that, to depicting that. I do like his depictions. We've gone a little bit over time here. I think we have to end this.
Yes, let's end there. Thank you so much.
I'm gonna thank you very much for joining Kalle Lundahl, and thank you everyone for listening in. And have a very nice morning, day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Until next, bye bye.